There is a moment in every love story where the truth becomes louder than the fairy tale. For Jason DeFord, the man the world knows as Jelly Roll, that moment arrived quietly, without drama, without a single explosive headline, and without the kind of public meltdown that most people expect when a famous marriage finally falls apart. He turned 41 years old carrying something heavy that most of his fans had no idea was even there. And when the truth finally surfaced, it did not arrive with a bang. It arrived the way most real and painful things do, slowly, softly, and with a dignity that left millions of people completely speechless. The news broke in mid-June of 2026, and the internet reacted the way it always does when something genuinely unexpected happens to people it has grown to love. The disbelief was immediate. The confusion was real. Because this was not supposed to be the couple that ended. This was supposed to be the one that made it. Jelly Roll and Bunnie XO had built their entire public identity around surviving the things that destroy other people. They had survived poverty, addiction, infidelity, and the kind of sudden blinding fame that quietly dismantles more relationships than it ever builds. So when the court records in Williamson County, Tennessee confirmed that Jason Bradley DeFord had filed for divorce from Elisa DeFord in May of 2026, citing irreconcilable differences, the world did not just feel surprised. It felt genuinely blindsided. But here's the thing about being blindsided. It almost never means the signs were not there. It usually just means we were not paying close enough attention to the right ones. Jelly Roll has never been a man who hides behind polished language or carefully managed public statements. That raw honesty is actually a significant part of why people fell so deeply in love with his story in the first place. He built his entire career on telling the truth about himself, including the ugly parts, the shameful parts, the parts that most public figures spend small fortunes trying to keep buried. So when he began quietly dropping pieces of a very honest conversation about marriage, commitment, and the unique pressure that extraordinary lives place on ordinary human bonds, most people heard it as general wisdom. Looking back now, it reads like something far more personal than that. In the spring of 2025, he sat down for an interview and said something that deserves to be repeated slowly and carefully. He said that anyone who believes marriage is a one-size-fits-all arrangement is eventually going to find themselves facing an ending they never planned for. He talked about how couples who try to force their relationship into a standard mold, one that does not actually fit the particular shape of their lives or their histories, are heading towards serious trouble. At the time, people nodded along and filed it away as interesting perspective from a man who had clearly done a lot of personal growing. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, those words sound far less like general relationship advice and far more like a man quietly narrating the specific pressure that was building inside his own home. That is the closest thing to a direct admission that Jelly Roll has offered. And it matters enormously, because it tells you that whatever happened between these two people was not sudden. It was not impulsive. It was not the result of one bad night or one terrible argument that spun too far out of control. This was something that had been quietly accumulating for a long time, the way water builds behind a dam that everyone keeps insisting is perfectly fine. To understand why this particular ending carries so much weight, you have to go back to the very beginning, to the summer of 2015, in Las Vegas, where two people who had absolutely no business falling in love with each other did exactly that. He was performing in a room that held maybe 20 people, sleeping in a van he had named himself because at that point in his life the van was genuinely one of his most consistent companions. She was there with someone else entirely. By every conventional measure of how romantic stories are supposed to begin, this one should never have started at all. But Bunnie has described that first moment of seeing him with a clarity that tends to stop people in their tracks when they hear it. She has talked about something inside her going completely still the instant she laid eyes on him, or recognition so deep and so immediate that it did not require any logic to support it. They became friends first, genuine friends, the kind who actually show up for each other. He would reach out to her for advice about his young daughter. She would listen and take it seriously. By 2016, that friendship had quietly transformed into something neither of them had a name for yet, and on the last night of August that year, standing together at a concert, he grabbed a microphone and asked her to marry him that same night in Las Vegas. She said yes without hesitation. They drove to a chapel and made it official, two completely broke people betting everything they had on each other, with nothing in their favor except a stubborn and beautiful kind of faith in what they felt. What followed that beginning was not a fairy tale in any clean or comfortable sense of the word. Bunnie walked into that marriage and immediately stepped up as a mother figure to children who were not biologically hers. She got sober for the sake of those kids. She helped fight custody battles. She built a life alongside a man who had very little to offer materially but clearly meant everything to her emotionally. The foundation they laid together in those early years was built with bare hands, under pressure, without resources, and against considerable odds. Which is exactly why what happened in 2018 carried such an enormous and specific key. End of devastation. 2 years into the marriage, Bunnie discovered that her husband had been unfaithful to her. This was not a single moment of weakness that he immediately came clean about. By the accounts that have emerged in the years since, the affair stretched across most of a year. The betrayal was deep enough that she gathered her things and returned to Las Vegas. The marriage, by every reasonable standard of measurement, appeared to be finished. What is genuinely remarkable is that it was not. They chose to fight for it. And Jelly Roll, to his credit, has spoken about that dark chapter with a kind of honesty that most public figures never find the courage to access. He admitted to the affair directly. He did not minimize it or reframe it or quietly redirect the conversation toward how hard things were for him at the time. He acknowledged the wreckage he caused and he spoke about the long, difficult, exhausting work of trying to rebuild what he had so carelessly broken. He talked about having surrounded himself during that period with people who were living in ways that slowly pulled him in directions he should never have gone. He took ownership of it without dressing the admission up in prettier clothing than it deserved. And Bunnie, eventually, reframed the entire experience in a way that revealed exactly how much inner strength it took for her to stay. She has talked about their early foundation as something that had to crumble completely before they could rebuild it on something genuinely solid. But she has also been honest about the cost of that rebuilding. She has admitted that it took years, not weeks, not months, but actual years before she stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Years before she could trust him with the fullness of herself again. She used the word disposable once when describing how the betrayal made her feel, and that word carries a weight that no amount of carefully curated social media happiness can completely erase. They made it through. They renewed their vows in Las Vegas in 2023, returning to the same chapel where it all began, and the images from that evening looked like the purest possible version of everything they had built together. She called herself the luckiest girl alive. He could not stop talking about how much she meant to him. It appeared, to everyone watching, that the hard part was finally, truly behind them. But fame is not a neutral force in a marriage. Fame is a pressure system, and it changes everything it touches, sometimes in ways that are impossible to see clearly until the damage is already done. The man who had once slept in a van was suddenly selling out arenas across the country. He had #1 songs, major award nominations, and a redemption story that the entire music industry had fallen completely in love with. He was everywhere, which meant he was home almost never. And while he was out there becoming one of the biggest names in American country music, Bunnie was building something equally significant and entirely her own. Her podcast became a genuine empire. She was pulling in well over 1 million downloads every single month. She climbed to the very top of the charts in her category. She built her own audience, her own income, her own identity that existed completely independently of who she was married to. The woman who had once been described primarily in relation to her husband had become a star in her own right, with her own platform and her own devoted following. On the surface, this looked like the beautiful story of two people thriving together. Underneath, it meant that two people who had once survived by staying very close to each other were now living in worlds so large and so separate that the distance between them had become its own kind of presence. And then there was the surrogacy. In early 2026, they shared what appeared to be the most joyful news of their entire journey together. After years of fertility struggles, blocked tubes, medical complications, and profound private grief over losses that most of their fans never fully understood the depth of, they announced that they had found a surrogate and were expecting twins using her eggs and his genetics. This was not a casual announcement. This was the culmination of years of hope and heartbreak. They stood at award shows during this period and thanked each other through visible tears. Everything about their public presence in those months suggested a couple moving towards something together. Which makes the timeline of what followed genuinely difficult to sit with. The separation date listed in the court filing is May 9 of 2026. The divorce was filed on May 18. These are dates that fall only weeks after the couple had been publicly celebrating a future they were building together. Either the relationship deteriorated with a speed that no outside observer could have predicted, or the private reality of what was happening between them had been diverging from the public version for considerably longer than anyone realized. The honest answer is almost certainly the second one. Real relationships rarely collapse in weeks. They erode over time, quietly and privately, in the space between two people who are both too busy, too tired, or too uncertain to address what is actually happening before it becomes irreversible. Jelly Roll himself has talked about this pattern in relationships broadly. He has discussed how easy it is for two people to keep moving forward on the surface while something essential between them has already quietly stopped. At 41, he is a man who has done enough genuine self-reflection to understand his own patterns with uncomfortable clarity. He has talked about the people and environments that shaped his worst decisions. He has talked about the work it takes to become someone different than the person your circumstances tried to make you. And in the way he has spoken about marriage over the past couple of years, there is a consistent thread that points toward a man wrestling with the specific challenge of maintaining genuine intimacy inside a life that had grown almost unimaginably large and complicated. What he seems to have finally admitted, not in a single dramatic confession but across a series of honest and careful conversations over time, is that love is not always enough to hold two people together when the shape of their lives has changed so fundamentally that they are no longer growing in the same direction. He and Bunnie built something extraordinary from absolutely nothing. They rebuilt it once after it was nearly destroyed. And somewhere in the years that followed that rebuilding, the life they were each individually living became something that no longer fit neatly inside the life they were theoretically living together. The way they have handled the ending says something important about both of them. There have been no public accusations. No leaked private conversations used as ammunition. No social media campaigns designed to control the narrative at the other person's expense. The people close to them have consistently described it as mutual, as private, as something both of them are navigating with care and with respect for what they meant to each other. She has been seen stepping back into her own identity with something that looks genuinely like determination rather than performance. He has thrown himself back into his work, which has always been the place where he processes what he cannot yet fully articulate. They still share the children they raised together. That bond does not dissolve because a legal marriage does. And anyone who has followed these two closely enough to understand what those children represent in both of their lives knows that the shared commitment to those kids is something that will keep them connected in meaningful ways regardless of what their personal relationship becomes going forward. Jelly Roll at 41 is not the same person who slept in a van in Las Vegas a decade ago. Neither is Bunnie the same person who walked into that small venue with someone else and felt something inside her go completely still at the sight of a stranger. They changed each other. They shaped each other. They built something together that genuinely mattered and genuinely lasted for a significant stretch of time through circumstances that would have broken most people entirely. What he has finally admitted, in the quiet and cumulative way that honest people tend to admit the hardest truths, is that sometimes loving someone completely and choosing to stay with them are two different decisions. And sometimes the most honest thing two people who genuinely care about each other can do is recognize that the version of their life that required them to be together has run its full and natural course. That is not a failure. Not by any meaningful measure. That is two people who chose each other fiercely when it mattered, held on longer and harder than most people would have, and then found enough respect for each other to let go without turning the ending into something ugly. The fairy tale did not end the way anyone expected. But then, if you go back and look at how it started, With a van, a chapel, and a promise made on nothing but faith, it was never really a conventional fairy tale to begin with. It was always something more complicated, more honest, and ultimately more human than that. And maybe that is the part worth remembering when all the noise finally settles.